They say a man's land reflects the truth of his character, what he grows, how he treats it, and how he stands when things go wrong. My name's Thomas Reed, and for the past 12 years, I've worked the same piece of earth that my father once walked on, back when this farmland wasn't much more than dry soil, rusted fencing, and hope held together by nails and prayers. I've weathered floods, droughts, failed harvests, and low market prices, but nothing ever cut deeper than the day someone I called family smiled at my table, praised my work, and then stole everything I'd grown right out from under me. It started like most betrayals do, quiet, slow, and disguised as kindness. Calvin Morrow was a name I hadn't heard since my aunt's funeral 8 years ago. A distant cousin on my mother's side, he was one of those people who floated in and out of family gatherings with slick charm and eyes that seemed to calculate every room he walked into. He showed up on my doorstep one morning in mid-September, wearing worn-out boots and a smile like he'd rehearsed it in a mirror. Said he'd been on the road, needed a place to stay a few nights, wanted to get his head straight and breathe some country air. I had no reason to say no. Family was family. Or so I thought. The first few days passed easily enough. Calvin was full of compliments, about the land, the house, even my dog, Tiller. He said I'd built something rare, something real, something men in cities only dreamed about between paychecks. He asked about the soil, the crop rotation, the market rates. He offered to help clean the shed, organize the feed bags, and even volunteered to digitize my sales ledger. Just for fun. Claiming he used to do bookkeeping work down in Tulsa before the company went belly up. Looking back, every word was oil slicked across a glass floor. He didn't just settle in, he made himself part of the rhythm. Ate meals with me, rode into town with Pete and me for feed, even sat with Aunt Martha on Sunday afternoons like he'd always been part of the picture. He offered to paint the front porch, fix the creaking barn door hinge, and once brought back coffee from the gas station with my name spelled right on the cup, like some kind of minor miracle. And for a while, I believed the act. One night, sitting on the porch beneath the rustling leaves of the old walnut tree, he looked out across the rows of corn and said, "You don't know what you have here, Tom. This isn't just dirt and crops. It's a damn gold mine. People in the city are paying triple for organic produce. You're leaving money on the table." I chuckled and told him I was happy just making enough to cover costs and keep the farm running. He laughed too, but there was something else behind his eyes, something calculating, like he was already doing math in his head and I was just part of the equation. At first, I dismissed the little things. A missing wrench from the toolbox. My notebook, the one I kept sales figures and inventory in, moved from the desk to the kitchen counter. A barrel of oats that didn't quite match what I remembered. When I asked Calvin, he always had an answer. "Oh, I moved that." Or, "You must have counted it wrong," said with a relaxed shrug and a friendly tone that disarmed my suspicion before it could grow. But something about it all felt off. The way he asked about when I usually slept. How late he stayed up, sometimes wandering the property alone at night. Once, he took the truck into town and didn't return until nearly 3 in the morning. Said he'd driven out to clear his head. I didn't push it. I figured maybe he was just restless. Lonely. I didn't want to believe he was planning something worse. The morning everything fell apart started just like any other. A crisp wind swept across the fields, and the sky was that clear, endless blue that only autumn brings. I woke early. Like always, made coffee, stepped outside to feed the animals, and instantly froze when I saw the barn doors wide open and the padlock lying on the ground in the dirt. Something deep in my gut twisted. I ran. Inside, where the crates of harvested corn, pumpkins, barley, and fresh-picked apples had been neatly stacked just the day before, there was now nothing but dust, splinters, and empty pallets. Every bushel, every crate, every covered row of produce I had carefully stored after weeks of backbreaking work, it was all gone. The trailer that I'd loaded up just 2 days ago, ready to haul to the co-op market, had vanished too. So had Calvin. The guest room was empty. No bag. No clothes. No goodbye note. Just an unmade bed and the scent of aftershave still hanging in the air like a final insult. Even the old Ford pickup was missing. I stood there, surrounded by absence, too shocked to speak, too sick to move. The entire season's crop, gone. Stolen in one night. And all I'd done was trust the wrong man. Pete arrived shortly after, his truck tires crunching the gravel like thunder. He took one look at the open barn, the empty lot, and the blank expression on my face before stepping out, his mug of coffee steaming in the cold air. He took everything, didn't he? I nodded, jaw clenched so tight I could barely form words. Pete cursed under his breath. Let's call Lenora. This is theft. We'll report it right now. I shook my head slowly. No, not yet. Tom, don't be stubborn. You've got enough here for a legal case. We call the police, let them handle. I said not yet. Because in that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't going to let Calvin just disappear into the fog, sell my hard work to some shady produce broker, and pretend like none of this happened. I wanted more than justice. I wanted to look him in the eye when it all came crashing down. So I drove. I didn't know where I was going at first, just let the road stretch out ahead of me until I found myself parked outside Aunt Martha's house. She was nearly 80 now, frail but fierce, and her words always landed heavier than most men's fists. She listened as I explained, eyes narrowing, her teacup untouched on the table. When I finished, she leaned forward, voice low but sharp as a scythe. You may be kind, Thomas, but you're not soft. And there's a difference. That boy took from you thinking you'd just swallow the loss and move on. He doesn't understand that men who work the soil know how to outlast anything, drought, storm, or thieves. I stared down at my hands, still stained from the harvest, and nodded. I'm going to find him. You don't need to find him alone. And it was in that moment I realized something else. If you've ever had someone smile in your face just to get you behind your back, if you've ever been burned by blood that should have had your back, then you'll understand why I'm sharing this. And maybe you should stick around, because you're not the only one who's been used like that, and I promise, this story doesn't end with silence. That night, I sat on the porch with Pete. Between the two of us, we started building a map, not just of where Calvin might have gone, but how he might have moved. The gas station he stopped at with my truck last week, the produce market where he talked too much to that buyer in Fairbank, the long-distance trucker who mentioned overhearing someone bragging about harvests falling into their lap. We didn't have surveillance or high-tech tools. But what we did have was memory, habit, and community. Around here, people notice a new face. Especially one hauling thousands of dollars worth of fresh crops with no co-op membership. I didn't want revenge by force. I wanted it by law. And I wanted him to see me standing there, calm, patient, unbroken, while the walls came down around him. A man like Calvin thinks if he's smiling while robbing you, you won't notice the knife in your back until it's too late. And when he left me standing in an empty barn with nothing but broken pallets, and the weight of my own trust, I knew exactly the kind of justice I wanted. One that didn't come with fists or shouting, but with silence, evidence, and a signature at the bottom of a warrant. I started by retracing everything I knew. First, the old Ford pickup, my truck, still titled in my name, and as recognizable around town as I was. That was his first mistake. It had a cracked rearview mirror, a faded Reed Farm decal above the bumper, and a missing hubcap on the passenger side rear wheel. If he'd tried to vanish with a vehicle that distinct, someone, somewhere, would have noticed. And I intended to find that someone. Pete helped me pull up a list of towns within a 100-mile radius that had small produce markets or agricultural wholesalers. We sat on the porch for hours, calling every contact we knew. Farmers, market stall owners, co-op drivers, even a mechanic who once worked on our irrigation rig. It didn't take long before we heard something interesting. Had a guy come through Fairbank 3 days ago, said one old market vendor over the phone. Claimed he was a private grower out of state, said his cousin owned a plot but gave it up. Paid cash, unloaded 5 crates of corn and 6 of apples. Trucks sound like yours had a busted taillight? It did. That night, I called Deputy Lenora Grant. Lenora and I grew up on opposite ends of Willowbrook. Her family were ranchers, but she left for law school, then came back when the sheriff offered her a badge. She wasn't loud, didn't like the politics that came with her job, but she had a memory like a ledger book and a stare that made liars squirm. When I told her everything, she didn't say, "Are you sure?" or, "That sounds complicated." She just asked me to come down to the station the next morning and bring every scrap of documentation I had. Inventory records, bank statements, delivery schedules, even notes Calvin had written. By noon, she was piecing it together. "This isn't just theft," she said, flipping through my crop ledger. "This is coordinated resale of stolen agricultural goods. He crossed county lines. That makes it interstate fraud if he took money under false pretenses." I blinked. "That's a thing?" She looked up at me. "It is now." Over the next week, Lenora opened a formal investigation. I gave her every name Calvin had mentioned during his stay, every location he talked about, every town he claimed to have passed through. Pete helped pull security cam screenshots from the co-op. One showed the back of my truck in a gas station outside of Halstead, time-stamped 2 hours after the crops were taken. You could even see the crates in the bed. But surveillance alone wasn't enough. We needed proof that Calvin was profiting off what he stole, and where. I told Lenora I wanted in. I didn't just want to wait for a phone call or a court summons. I wanted to be there when the hammer fell. She didn't object. She just said, "Then get ready. You'll need to play this smart." We devised a plan. I would call Calvin from a burner phone Pete picked up in town. I'd pretend to be a small market reseller, interested in buying more of his excess harvest. Lenora and I scripted out the entire conversation. I had to keep him talking, confirm that he had crops to sell, and more importantly, get him to admit they were grown by family. If he did that, and we had the recording, we could pin him not just with theft but with resale under false ownership. The call happened 3 days later. He picked up on the second ring. "Yeah? Hey," I said, putting on a slight southern drawl. "Got your number from someone in Fairbank. Heard you were moving fresh product on the low. That true?" There was a pause, then the sound of a chair scraping. "Who's asking?" "Name's Glenn. I'm just looking for apples and corn, local grown, quick cash." Another pause. Then he laughed, low and cocky. "Yeah. I can move some crates. Got 'em from a family farm. My cousin got tired of the grind, handed the whole stash over. Said I could sell it myself. And there it was." Lenora nodded from across the table, already hitting the button to download the call. "Where you at?" I asked. "Lansing." "Perfect." I said I'd meet him the next morning. What Calvin didn't know was that I wouldn't be coming alone. We arrived in Lansing just after dawn. Lenora brought another deputy and a local officer in plain clothes. Calvin had set up in the back lot of a gas station, right near the interstate off-ramp. His truck backed into a shaded corner, tailgate down, crates arranged neatly like a pop-up roadside market. He was sipping coffee and flipping through his phone, looking like a man who thought he'd won something. When I stepped out of the cruiser, wearing the same flannel he'd seen me in a dozen times, his smile faltered. When Lenora stepped out behind me and flashed her badge, it disappeared altogether. "Calvin Morrow," she said, voice firm and direct. "You're being detained for questioning in relation to the theft and unauthorized resale of agricultural goods across state lines. Please place your hands where we can see them." He blinked. "Wait, what?" But Lenora was already reading his rights. As the cuffs clicked behind his back, he finally looked at me. And that's when I saw it, the crack in the mirror. The confidence gone. The smooth talker stripped of his lines. "You set me up," he muttered. "No," I said quietly. "You set yourself up. I just made sure someone was watching." That single moment, That stunned, silent realization on his face was worth every late night, every panicked morning, every second I'd spent wondering how I'd been so blind. He thought I was just a farmer with dirt under his nails and no sense of the real world. He thought because I kept quiet, I'd stay that way. He didn't realize that the law might move slow out here, but it moves steady. Back at the station, Lenora processed everything. Calvin had nearly $6,000 in cash in his truck, half of it from my stolen crops. We logged every dollar, every receipt. The produce crates still had Reed Farm stamped faintly on the bottom panels. It was sloppy, unprofessional, and exactly what we needed to make the charges stick. Now, if you've ever been wronged by someone who thought your kindness made you weak, if you've ever smiled at someone across a dinner table only to realize later they were planning to burn down your whole house, then you already know how good it felt to watch justice walk in with a badge and not a baseball bat. And if this story hits close to home, maybe it's time you stuck around. Because this isn't the end. Not even close. Calvin was released on bail 2 days later. But it didn't matter. Lenora filed everything with the county prosecutor. The charges were official. I'd see him again, this time in court. And when I did, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. The truth would do it for me. There's something permanent about courtrooms, something in the way the air feels heavier inside those walls, as if every breath taken in that room must carry the weight of consequence. The morning Calvin Morrow was scheduled to appear before the judge, I wasn't thinking about vengeance or victory. I was thinking about closure. The barn was still quieter than it should have been, the shelves weren't as full, and the winter orders were smaller than in previous years. But the truth was catching up to the man who had tried to gut my livelihood under the guise of kinship. And that, more than anything, had brought peace back to my front porch. When I stepped into the county courthouse, wearing the brown work jacket that still smelled faintly of hay and the boots I'd worn through 5 seasons of planting, I was not there to watch a man fall. I was there to watch him finally stand before something he couldn't manipulate with charm or lies. Aunt Martha sat to my left, wrapped in her gray shawl, her cane resting against the pew. Pete stood behind me like he always did, tall and broad, hands tucked into the pockets of his old denim coat, watching every inch of that room with the same quiet loyalty he'd shown me since he first walked onto the farm 12 years ago. Calvin shuffled in about 10 minutes late, eyes darting like he was hoping the floor might open up and swallow him before it all started. He wore a wrinkled white dress shirt that hung too loose on him, and a cheap tie that hadn't been pulled tight. The confident smirk he once wore around my breakfast table was nowhere to be found, replaced now with a tired grimace, as if he'd finally accepted that there would be no fast-talking his way out of what he'd done. The clerk read the charges aloud: multiple counts of agricultural theft, falsifying product origin for commercial resale, and unauthorized use of a registered vehicle. The number of offenses was long enough to make even the judge raise an eyebrow, but Calvin's lawyer, clearly assigned by the court, did little more than shuffle papers and mumble objections that didn't go anywhere. Lenora sat in the front row on the prosecution's side, posture straight, eyes fixed, her badge clipped to her blazer like it belonged in that courtroom just as much as the flag hanging above the judge's head. When they asked me to speak, I didn't read from the prepared statement I'd written the night before. Instead, I looked at Calvin directly and told the room, slowly and without anger, how it felt to walk into a barn that had been emptied overnight by someone who had smiled at my table, eaten my food, and called me cousin, with no hesitation. I described the weeks of work, the money lost, the customers I had to call and disappoint, the embarrassment I felt telling them I couldn't deliver. I told them about my family's name being tied to a farm that had once been reliable, consistent, respected, and how in just one night, that name had been dragged through mud not by weather, not by pests, not by economic downturn, but by betrayal from someone who never planted a seed yet took the entire harvest. I could feel the room listening. Not just hearing, but listening. And when I finished, the judge asked if Calvin wanted to respond. He stood slowly, as if the weight of guilt had finally settled fully onto his shoulders. He didn't speak right away. When he did, The words came out thinner than I expected. I never meant to hurt him. It was quiet. Hollow. I thought he'd be fine. He's got the land. He's got people helping him. I didn't think it would ruin anything. The judge leaned forward, stern and steady. Mr. Morrow, you removed over $6,000 worth of produce from private property, forged statements about its origin, and transported it across state lines for cash profit, all while pretending to be a guest in Mr. Reed's home. That is not a misunderstanding. That is calculated theft. The sentence wasn't jail. Lenora had warned me that for a first-time offender with no record and a cooperative attitude during the investigation, incarceration was unlikely. But the restitution was full. Every penny of the stolen crop's value would be paid back, not just in damages but in business losses calculated from missed market sales. Calvin would also serve nearly a year of supervised community service with agricultural restrictions, meaning he'd be forbidden from working on or around privately owned farms or produce businesses. His name would also be submitted to the Missouri AG Board, blacklisting him from any legal farming or distribution license for 5 years. It wasn't iron bars. But it was a door slamming shut on the future he thought he could steal. And I'll be honest with you, if you've ever been made to feel like your trust was your weakness, like your hospitality was foolish, or like being the kind one in the room meant you were the easiest to betray, then you'll understand exactly what it felt like to see the gavel fall and know, without raising my voice or dirtying my hands, I had won something permanent. Not revenge. Not applause. But quiet, clean justice. After the hearing, Aunt Martha leaned over, patted my hand gently, and said, "He thought he was taking apples and corn. He didn't know he was gambling with your entire life. And now he's learning the price." In the weeks that followed, I focused not on what I'd lost but what I could still build. With help from Pete and 2 friends from a neighboring farm, I managed to prepare a winter greenhouse batch to keep our local orders running. Customers came back one by one. Some left handwritten notes in the delivery crates, saying they'd heard what happened and were proud to keep doing business with Reed Farm. And for the first time since the theft, I allowed myself to feel something close to pride again, not the arrogant kind, but the steady, earned kind that grows slowly, like roots deep in the soil. By the time spring came around, the farm wasn't just surviving, it was recovering. Pete and I built a new security shed, this one with reinforced locks, motion lights, and backup batteries. I installed cameras along the perimeter of the storage barn and added an updated inventory system, one with off-site backups and automatic logs. It was expensive, sure, but it felt right. Because trust, once broken, doesn't just heal, it requires structure. About 3 months after the trial, Pete came back from the feed supply store shaking his head, wearing the kind of smirk that meant a story was coming. "You're not gonna believe who I saw down in Belridge," he said, tossing me a sack of grain. I raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." "Calvin. Wearing a state reforestation vest. Out by the floodplain, planting saplings with 2 other guys and a ranger breathing down his neck. Shovel in hand. No truck. No clipboard. Just dirt and sweat." I couldn't help but chuckle. There was something undeniably fitting about it. The man who tried to steal a harvest he never sowed was now spending his days planting trees he never lived to see mature, digging into soil that wouldn't pay him back, watched every hour, unable to run. It was a kind of poetic correction that not even I could have designed better. I never saw Calvin again. Didn't need to. My peace didn't depend on watching him suffer or fail. It depended on knowing that I had protected what was mine not with rage, but with resolve. That I hadn't let one man's betrayal shape who I was or how I lived. Today, if someone drives past Reed Farm, they'll see a clean barn, fresh rows of green pushing up through the soil, and a new wooden sign at the gate that reads, "Grown with care, protected with purpose." It's not just a slogan, it's a reminder. That this land, and everything on it, came from sweat and patience, not shortcuts or schemes. And if you've ever had someone try to rip away what you built, If you've ever been used by someone who smiled only to twist the knife when you weren't looking, then I hope this story reminds you of something important. You don't need to explode to win. You don't need revenge that looks like violence. Sometimes, the best kind of justice is slow, silent, and rooted, like a seed planted deep, growing stronger each day under the surface, until one day the world sees it bloom. Not because you forced it, but because it was inevitable.